Chapter 1. Sleep was torn from me by the loud crash of waves. My body swayed gently from side to side, and there was a fog blanketing my mind, a halfway lucid feeling, as if I was coming out of a dream that I couldn't quite remember. A faint ache in my forehead prompted me to try and lift an arm, only to find that I couldn't move. Strange. Was I still dreaming? What was the last thing I could remember? A ship. Yes, that sounded right. I was on a ship. Slowly, it was beginning to return to me. I had boarded the Oasis in France, bound for Dover, and had scarcely been a few hours into the journey when the memories formed knots in my stomach. It was difficult to recall all the details, but I remembered the entire ship reeling and the sounds of cannons firing. I remembered hearing a panicked cry of "Pirates!" from the crow's nest. Beset by a burst of panic, my eyes flew open, but I saw nothing. Confused, I began blinking rapidly, frantically trying to make my eyes work before I noticed a small sliver of light just underneath my line of sight, above my nose. Realizing that there was something fastened over my eyes, and that I had not, in fact, gone blind, I relaxed. For only a brief moment before I began to register all the other things that were wrong. As I had discovered earlier, I could not move my arms. They were tightly bound at the opposite side of what felt like a thick wooden pole behind me, anchoring me to the spot. My legs, too, were tied together beneath my skirts, with rope coiled and knotted around my ankles and just below my knees. I was rendered immobile. My first instinct was to cry for help, but when I tried, my voice was muffled into a soft whimper. A wad of cloth had been shoved in between my teeth, blocking sound. Naturally, I tried to push it out with my tongue, and found that not only was it being held in place by several more strips of fabric wrapped around my mouth, but that it tasted so overwhelmingly of salt that it numbed my tongue almost immediately on contact. The floor creaked with the movement of the water beneath it. Trying my best to hold down the instinct to panic, I listened closely, wondering if any of my captors were nearby. I couldn't hear anything, apart from the crashing of the ocean. Was I alone? The thought somehow made fear rise in my throat even faster. I had an urge to cry out again. Gathering my breath, I let out a high-pitched scream, loud enough to penetrate the layers of my thick gag. It didn't take long for me to receive a response.
Jesus Christ!
A voice cut through the air, startling me back into silence.
You don't need to be so fucking loud. I'm standing right next to you.
The voice was unmistakably male, and not at all what I had expected to hear. Even in clear annoyance, his tone was calm, composed, and almost polite. Recovering, I began to strain as hard as I could against my bonds, and let out a moan to convey my displeasure. It took a few more moments of whimpering and useless struggling before I heard a sigh, and then felt hands glide around my head until they met in the back. The band around my eyes loosened and then came off completely. As I blinked to adjust my vision, the first thing I saw were two bluish-grey eyes surveying me evenly. The color was so startlingly deep that it looked as though one could drown in them. It caught me off guard, and I had to rip myself away from them in order to observe my surroundings. The small room we were in was made of grimy wooden boards, with a table towards the back and several bar stools and chairs, some of which had been tipped over onto their sides. There were a few metal tankards lying on the ground, and as I glanced to my right, I saw a porthole, outside of which I could make out some rolling grey waves. My eyes returned to those of my captor, who was crouched before me and seemed to be engaged in a careful assessment. I took the opportunity to study him in turn. As with his voice, he did not look at all how I expected a pirate to look. He was clean-shaven, with only a hint of stubble around his chin, his face surprisingly clean and free of dirt or grease. Thick black hair fell across his forehead and over his ears, just reaching the nape of his neck. He stared straight back at me, unabashedly, not breaking his analytical gaze for even a moment. There was something strangely soothing about his eyes. They were like a sky just before a storm, and the more I gazed into them, the easier I breathed. My panic began to subside.
You look like you have something to say,
he said finally. I blinked in surprise, but nodded immediately. The salty taste in my mouth was beginning to make me feel sick.
If I remove that gag and you make a fuss, it's not coming off again, understood?
As though there's any point in calling for help. I nodded again. He lowered himself to his knees and wrapped his arms around my head, working on the knots that were holding the gag in place. He undid one cloth, and then another, and then a third, before he was finally able to remove the wad that had been pushed in between my teeth. As he extracted it, I was overcome by a fit of coughing, trying not to gag from the lingering taste on my tongue. Why was it so salty? I asked, once I was able.
We're at sea, my lady,
he said, with a surprising level of courtesy.
Seawater tends to get into everything. You'd be hard-pressed to find anything around here that doesn't taste of salt.
Would you kindly mind bringing me some fresh water, then? I asked, matching his unusually polite tone. My throat is quite dry. He paused for a moment, and then exhaled another sigh, getting to his feet and crossing the room to the door. He stepped out for a few moments before returning with a tankard.
Drink,
he said, holding it up to my lips. As I drank, my captor slowly tilted the cup, keeping the water flowing, not too fast nor too slow. Never in my life had water tasted so good.
Better now?
He asked, lowering the cup. Yes. He raised an eyebrow at me, clearly dissatisfied with my answer. It took me a moment to realize what he was waiting for. Thank you, I added, reluctantly. Quickly, he got up, setting the now empty tankard on the table. Turning swiftly, he seized a chair on his way back to me, and deposited it so that its back faced me. Catching my gaze once more, he dropped into his seat, unerringly silent, with his legs spread wide to accommodate the position. Another moment of silence passed, and then he spoke.
Listen, I know you're in a shite position here.
How perceptive of you! He raised a hand purposefully, making his thoughts on my sarcasm clear. I flinched and braced myself for the impact. But it never came. Instead, he leaned forward and grabbed hold of my chin.
I'm just trying to be nice, which I'm not obligated to do,
he said softly.
But if you keep that up, you might just sour my mood, and I don't think you want that. Do I make myself clear?
Pressing my lips together in annoyance, I nodded. He let go of me and continued.
For the record, I was opposed to taking a hostage when we raided your ship. Unfortunately, the rest of the crew felt otherwise, and so here you are. I thought the least I could do was assign myself to guard duty.
Assign yourself, I repeated. Are you the captain?
No, I'm the Quartermaster. Do you know what that means?
You're in charge of the finances. That did explain why he seemed to have more than half a brain, contrary to my preconception of the average pirate. He seemed mildly surprised that I knew this, a smirk playing across his mouth.
Correct. In any case, I'm sure you're wondering what happens next.
The thought may have crossed my mind. He shot me a warning look, but let the comment slide this time.
We'll be sailing to the next free port,
he said.
Once we get there, we'll send a ransom letter to your family. All you'll have to do is behave and sit pretty until they cough up the gold, and then we can all go our separate ways.
I felt panic beginning to rise in my chest again, but struggled to keep my tone even, swallowing hard. And by sit pretty, I assume you mean I'm to remain bound to this post for the entire ordeal? I asked. He blinked, and for the first time looked somewhat apologetic as he grimaced.
That is the standard procedure, yes.
Why? I found myself saying before I could stop myself. Tell me, what's the point in that? Where exactly am I going to go? He stared me down hard for a moment before responding.
Those ropes are there to keep you from doing anything stupid,
he informed me.
Damaged goods are worthless goods, and we're trying to turn a profit.
I clenched my teeth. Goods. So that's all I was to them. Then again, why was I surprised? That was all I was to anyone. It was becoming harder and harder not to completely give in to the fear that threatened to consume me. So I channeled the energy into anger instead, and my mouth began to run away from me. I'd heard that pirates were dim-witted, but I never realized it was quite to this extent. I'm curious how you plan to turn a profit once the British Navy blows you all to pieces, because that's the only way I see all of this ending. I didn't have time to regret saying it before he suddenly rose from his chair and knelt down to be at my eye level, once again grabbing my chin with a firm hand.
You let me worry about that,
he growled.
In the meantime, I'll remind you that you are a prisoner, and speech is a privilege that I don't have to grant you.
I scowled and sharply jerked my head away from him. For a moment, he looked as though he might really strike me this time, but he just clicked his tongue in irritation, and then picked up one of the bolts of cloth that had made up my gag. My stomach leapt, and I tried to lean away, opening my mouth to protest, but abruptly he grabbed a handful of my hair and pushed my head back. A cry of pain began to rise out of my throat. But the sound was quickly blocked as he shoved the wadded-up fabric back into my mouth. I moaned in protest, but didn't have the chance to try and spit it out before he wrapped another bolt around my head, holding the gag in place. He knotted it tightly enough that I felt it pull uncomfortably at the corners of my mouth, and I began to struggle again out of frustration, shooting him as vitriolic a glare as I could manage. It didn't seem to trouble him. Shaking his head, he picked up another one of the kerchiefs and tied it over my eyes, robbing me once again of my vision. A moment later, I felt his breath on my left ear, a strand of his hair gently tickling the side of my face.
You might want to consider being a little more well-behaved,
he advised.
There's a long journey ahead of us.
With that, he pulled away, and I heard him stand, leaving me with nothing but darkness.